Every once in a while, you hear a chord in a song, and the first thing that comes to your mind is, ooh, that's jazzy. Well, why is that? What's actually happening in those chords that makes them sound like that? What is it about their musical construction that might stick out to you as really fitting into a jazz context? Well, let's take a look at that. Let's refresh our memory just a little bit as to how we actually build chords. Now, we know that chords are just a combination of different intervals. Pretty much just two or more notes played together. And it really doesn't matter what combination of notes that you play, you can find a way to define it harmonically. We have major chords, we have minor chords. Now you may have heard in the past that a chord sounds jazzy when we add the seventh, and that's definitely where it starts. Well, what do we mean when we say that? Let's start by looking at the major scale, which we base most things on in applied music theory. It's a string of notes, and we give those notes numbers. We say quite simply that it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that leads us back to where we started, an octave up. If you want to make a regular C major chord, well, all we have to do is take the first, third, and the fifth degree of that major scale, play those notes together, and that's your major chord. Now, when we start talking about sevenths, it literally just means the seventh degree of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the naturally occurring seventh in the key of C is B. Let's go ahead and add that to our C triad. We have 1, 3, and 5. Now let's add the seventh. And here we get a chord that starts to sound what many people would refer to as jazzy. And the cool thing about this combination of 1, 3, 5, and 7 is that it can occur in a bunch of different ways. This is just the naturally occurring major seventh chord in the key of C. However, we can start making changes. What if we took that E and made it E flat? Well, then we get this sound, which is really interesting. We call this one C minor, major 7. Well, what if we make that one flat? Well, we get this minor seventh chord. So these different sounds, they're all really useful, and they all have maybe what we would start to call more of a jazz sound. But that's really just scratching the surface as to what makes a chord sound jazzy. There are a couple of other significant factors that affect how jazzy a chord sounds to our ears. Just a reminder before we jump into it, everything is 30% off on the Cornell Music Academy right now using code MUSICTHEORY30, link in the description down below. The first really significant factor that I want to talk about, and this is perhaps one of the most important, and that is context. If I were to sit down and play this chord progression, you might recognize that from so many different things, but it probably doesn't sound particularly jazzy to you. And that's because contextually, it's really not. It's a progression that we hear time and time again in a lot of pop and more modern mainstream styles of music. And so to us, when we hear that, it doesn't necessarily sound super jazzy. However, if I sat down and I played, well, now we're starting to play some harmony that wouldn't necessarily feel super at home in a pop context, but you start thinking about it in a jazz context, and all of a sudden you go, oh yeah, that kind of sounds more familiar. Well, let's go back to the first chord progression that we played. Let's play those same chords, but we're gonna change some things. And all of a sudden you're gonna go, oh, this is starting to sound jazzy. The very first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna add the sevenths to every single one of those chords. It's gonna start to sound a little more jazz oriented, but it's not necessarily going to be like, oh, that's jazz. See that? What? Watch that. Ready? That right there is one of the things that kind of sticks out as being like, well, all of the others sound like they could still work in that pop context until we get to that striking dominant chord. Now, it's not that dominant chords don't exist in pop music, in more mainstream music. Of course they do. But the really pronounced dominant sound there, which relies on this combination of major with a flat 7. So you can see we're starting to get to our next significant factor of what makes a chord sound jazzy, and that is, of course, dissonance. In music, we basically have two descriptions of sound in terms of how much they go together with each other or they fight each other, and that's consonance, which would be like an octave. They're the same note, it's extremely smooth. We start to hear a relationship between these two. If we play a fifth, Where we get into dissonance is when we start introducing notes that don't go as well together. Our tritone is an example of that. Those two notes, they fight each other quite a bit. The frequency that you might hear in your ears, it's a little bit right? But that gets even crazier as we start doing things like major sevenths. Also a minor second. There's a lot of fighting between those two notes. That's very dissonant. When we played that pop chord progression, simply adding the sevenths did not necessarily turn it into jazz, even though it started to hint a little more at a jazz sound. Watch what happens when I make the next step. That doesn't work at all in context here. Let's go back to our chord progression that sounded a little more jazz. That was this thing. Okay, now let's build that out. The sound of those chords is kind of unmistakable, and there's no way that you would really expect to hear anything like that in pop music. Why? Because it carries so much more dissonance. Yes, it has a lot of sevenths in it. Yes. However, there is another factor, and that is upper extensions. Anything outside of the first octave of a chord. We said that adding the seventh helps it start to sound a little bit jazzy, but watch what happens when we start adding things like ninths. Okay, let's keep going to 11. Okay, well that's a little strange, but here's the thing about upper extensions. We can alter them the same way that we altered our third and that we could alter our seventh. We can change around our upper extensions as much as we want. Let's try making it sharp. Woo, that is beautiful. And that's what we would call a C major 7 with a sharp 11. And we can keep going from there. 11, 12, 13. Look at that. That sounds gorgeous. Well, things can get even crazier when we're talking about that chord that didn't quite fit into the pop chord progression, right? Remember when we added the sevenths and we went... We got here, we said because of the dissonance of the tritone, it's something that we hear less so in pop music and more modern mainstream stuff. But in jazz, we take that dissonance and we crank it up. So a chord that might start out very simply like this, a G7 chord, might turn into something like this. a G7 flat 9 sharp 11 13 chord. See what we're doing here? We're creating these alterations on the upper extensions to create more and more tension, more and more dissonance within a single chord. This is the unmistakable sound when we start thinking about what makes a chord sound jazzy. So you see, where harmony in pop music and maybe more modern mainstream music focuses a lot on consonance and simplicity, jazz kind of goes the other way with it and focuses a lot on adding a lot of color. And it's that dissonant tension that gets built and then released. Something like a 5-1 with a whole bunch of color tones and upper extensions might sound like this. Get a load of that. Get a load of the amount of dissonance there that gets released. And this, of course, is not to say that pop music and really any form of music doesn't utilize this tension release built with discipline and upper extensions and alterations. But it certainly is something that we find more so in jazz than perhaps many other forms of music. When we do hear some of these components in modern pop music, it makes it sound that much cooler. And this is something that we've seen Jacob Collier really take advantage of, making modern sounding music with a lot of jazz influence harmony. And so when we ask the question, what makes a chord sound jazzy, the short answer is there are so many factors that can create that jazz sound. But in general, we find that they contain lots of color, gratuitous dissonance. It's very hard to mistake the sound of a G7 sharp 9 flat 13 chord. right? Seems confusing and all that kind of stuff. And at first it can be, but it does get way easier as you dig into it further. And before you know it, it just becomes second nature. But you might be just looking for a place to start on the keyboard in general. And that's why our Intro to Piano course is a great place to do that. You can get it for 30% off right now using code MusicTheory30. There's a link down in the description below. You can also check out our Intro to Improv course and our Making Sense of Modes course to learn more about each of those topics. It's the best way you can support the channel, and I really appreciate it. So thank you. And thank you for watching this video and taking the time to do that. That's gonna be all for me today, and we will see you in the next one.